You can't breathe. Wood presses against your throat, your wrists locked at brutal angles beside your face. This torture device this Kang meant for animals has become your world. You're 15 years old, your name is Temujin, and somewhere in the darkness behind your swollen eyes, you're not thinking about escape. You're thinking about power, because you've just realized something that will reshape human history, that loyalty is a lie, that mercy is weakness, and that the only thing separating the enslaved from the master is the willingness to draw a line between who deserves protection and who doesn't. I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. It amazes me that a story from 8 centuries ago still reaches every corner of the planet. There's a reason for that. What this teenager learned in chains would create the largest empire the world has ever seen, built on a foundation so methodical, so legally sophisticated, that modern scholars still struggle to reconcile the progressive lawmaker with the architect of industrial-scale human trafficking. This is 1177, the frozen steppes of Mongolia. The boy in the Kang had once been the son of a Khanate, much of one, but nobility nonetheless. Then his father Yasuge was poisoned at a feast, not killed in battle, poisoned. The ultimate betrayal of steppe hospitality. And in that moment, 9-year-old Temujin learned his first lesson about the nature of human bonds. His father's clan held a meeting. These were people who had sworn blood oaths, who had shared food and war and winters. They looked at Temujin's mother Holen and her 5 young children and made a calculation. 6 mouths to feed dead weight, a liability in a world where spring comes late and winter kills the weak. So they left. They mounted their horses and they rode away, and they abandoned a woman and 5 children on the open steppe in the dead of winter, knowing exactly what that meant. Holen kept them alive through force of will that bordered on supernatural. She dug for roots with her bare hands. She trapped marmots. She taught her children to eat things that weren't food, but would keep their stomachs from eating themselves. A Khan's widow reduced to scavenging. But young Temujin absorbed something darker than survival skills. He was learning that every oath, every tradition, every sacred bond meant absolutely nothing when tested. That family was a fiction. That loyalty was conditional. That the only currency that mattered was raw, undeniable power. And then came the Kang. The rival Taishad clan captured him. Not for ransom. His family had nothing. They captured him to humiliate him, to display him as a trophy. They locked his neck and wrists in wooden boards and paraded him through their camps like a broken animal. Every night, a different guard. Every day, a new humiliation. But here's what the Taishud didn't understand. They weren't breaking him. They were educating him. While his body suffered, his mind studied. He watched the guards drink themselves stupid during festivals. He noticed that discipline collapsed when celebration began. He observed that even his captors had weaknesses, patterns, predictable failures. And he waited. When the night came during the spring festival, when the entire camp was drunk, and dancing Temujin made his move, he struck his guard unconscious with the Kang still locked around his neck, stumbled into the river, and hid beneath driftwood with just his face above water, weighted down by the torture device that should have killed him. A young man named Chillon found him there. And in a moment that could have ended differently, Chillon made a choice. He broke the Kang. He hid Temujin in a cart of wool. He let him escape. Years later, Chillon would become one of Genghis Khan's greatest generals. But in that moment, what Temujin learned wasn't about kindness. It was about leverage. About identifying what people want and using that knowledge to survive. 3 experiences: abandonment, enslavement, escape. Together, They forged something unprecedented in a 15-year-old's mind, a vision of society built not on family or tradition or honor, but on law, systematic, ruthless, unbreakable law. And at the heart of that vision was a question that would define an empire: who deserves protection. Fast forward to 1206. Temujin has done the impossible. He's conquered or absorbed every major tribe on the Mongolian steppe. The endless cycle of raids and blood feuds that defined Mongol life for centuries, it's over. At a great assembly by the Anan River, under a white banner with 9 tails, he's proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler, or perhaps oceanic ruler, depending on which scholar you trust. But titles don't build empires, systems do. His first act isn't foreign conquest. It's something far more radical. He announces a legal code that will govern this new nation, the Yassa. And when you read it, when you really examine it, you understand why historians are so conflicted. Because by 13th century standards, parts of it were genuinely progressive. It became illegal to kidnap women revolutionary in a culture where bride abduction was routine. Women gained property rights. Adultery was punishable by death for both parties equally. All children were legitimate, even those born to slave mothers. Religious tolerance was mandated. A meritocracy was established. A shepherd could become a general based on ability alone. And perhaps most telling, it became illegal for any Mongol to be enslaved. If a Mongol was captured, any other Mongol who encountered them was legally obligated to free them or face severe punishment. Reading this, you'd think the boy who wore the slave's yoke had learned empathy from his trauma. You'd think he was building a just society. But buried in the Yassa were quieter provisions. The same law that forbade the enslavement of Mongols explicitly permitted the enslavement of everyone else. The same law that mandated helping enslaved Mongols escape prescribed death for anyone who helped a non-Mongol slave escape. Religious tolerance. Absolutely, as long as you paid your taxes. And part of that tribute could be human. Do you see what he did? He didn't abolish slavery. He weaponized it. He created a two-tier world where all the progressive, enlightened laws applied exclusively to one group, while everyone else existed in a legal void where they had no protections whatsoever. But the Yassa did something even more fundamental. It dismantled the entire tribal structure that had betrayed him as a child. He reorganized the Mongol population into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Your commander wasn't your clan chief anymore. Your loyalty wasn't to family. It was to your unit and ultimately to the Khan himself. If one man in a unit of 10 fled battle, the entire unit would be executed. If one unit in a group of 10 broke, all 10 units would be punished. Collective responsibility, self-enforcing, impersonal, perfect. It didn't rely on loyalty to a person. It relied on fear of a system, and his generals, who'd genuinely believed they were building something better than the chaotic steppe life of the past, started to see the architecture differently. The first crack came with a governor named Huki. He'd been appointed to govern tribes in the Siberian forest regions, an effective administrator. Taxes were collected, order maintained, but Huki started abducting local women for his personal collection. Not one or two, dozens. Using his position to build a private harem, the Yassa explicitly forbade kidnapping women. It was one of the most celebrated progressive elements of the code. The local tribes rebelled. They captured Huki and killed him. Genghis Khan sent an army to crush the rebellion, not to punish Huki's crimes, to punish the tribes for daring to resist. The message was crystalline. Huki's crime wasn't the abductions. It was getting caught. It was creating instability. The Yassa protected Mongol women. Everyone else operated in a different category entirely. His generals began to understand they'd misread the situation. The law wasn't about justice, it was about efficiency, about creating a stable, powerful Mongol nation that could project force outward without cannibalizing itself. But they didn't fully comprehend the implications. Not yet, not until Bukhara. It's February 1220. Bukhara is one of the jewels of the Islamic world. Libraries containing knowledge from across the known world, craftsmen producing textiles and metalwork so exquisite that kings from Europe to China compete to own them. Markets overflowing with silk and spices and ideas, 30,000 people, protected by walls and a garrison that's never fallen. And Genghis Khan's army arrives like a storm system, but they don't immediately attack. They surround the city completely, cut every supply route, and they send a message: surrender now, pay tribute, acknowledge Mongol authority, and you'll be spared. Resist and face total annihilation. The governor looks at his walls, his soldiers, his supplies. He thinks he can wait them out. He refuses. The Mongols divert a river, flooding the defensive moat, destroying the walls. Within days, the outer defenses collapse. The garrison tries to fight their way out. They're slaughtered almost to a man. The citadel holds for 12 more days, but it's pointless. When it finally falls, every soldier inside is executed. But here's what shocks the generals. The civilian population isn't massacred. Not yet. Genghis Khan himself rides into the city, directly to the Grand Mosque. His soldiers throw the sacred Qurans onto the floor. They use the ornate chests that held these holy texts as feed troughs for their horses. Then he orders the city's elite to gather in the mosque's courtyard. The wealthy merchants, the religious leaders, the nobility, they stand there having watched their city fall in days, having seen their soldiers butchered, and this short, unremarkable-looking man with cold, calculating eyes speaks, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Think about the psychological precision of that statement. He's using their own religious framework as a weapon, telling them their own God sent him to destroy them, that their suffering is divine judgment. It's not just conquest, it's theological annihilation. And then something happens that will haunt the generals for the rest of their lives. The Mongol soldiers don't rampage. There's no chaos, no random slaughter. Instead, they start sorting. The entire population of Bukhara is divided into categories with bureaucratic efficiency. First category, skilled artisans, weavers who create the finest textiles, metalworkers who forge weapons and armor, engineers who understand siege equipment and irrigation, scribes who read and write multiple languages. These people are registered, names written down, skills cataloged. They're told they'll be relocated to Karakoram, the Mongol capital, where they'll work for the Khan. Their families can come. They'll be fed, housed, protected as long as they work. It's not freedom, but it's not death. It's privileged slavery. Second category, young, able-bodied men, formed into labor battalions. But here's where it gets truly dark. They're not just laborers. They're Karash, human shields. In the next siege, these men from Bukhara will be driven ahead of the Mongol army, forced to fill moats with their bodies, to scale walls first, to absorb the first wave of arrows, to die so Mongol soldiers don't have to. And it's psychological warfare on a massive scale because defenders in the next city will look over their walls and see their neighbors, their fellow Muslims, being driven forward by Mongol whips. The moral horror of killing their own people often breaks a city's will before the actual battle begins. Third category, women and children. Further subdivided, young, attractive women distributed as property to Mongol soldiers or sent to slave markets. Some kept as concubines, others as domestic servants. The children and, this is perhaps most insidious, adopted into Mongol households. Not from kindness, from strategy. Raised from young ages, they forget their original language, their culture, and become functionally Mongol. Cultural genocide through adoption. Fourth category, the elderly, the sick, the disabled, those with no useful skills. These people simply disappear from the historical record. The silence tells you everything you need to know. Imagine you're one of Genghis Khan's generals watching this unfold. You've been following this man for years. You believed in the Yassa. You believed you were building something better. And now you're watching an entire city being processed like livestock, watching human beings reduced to economic units, watching the same man who forbade the enslavement of Mongols oversee the systematic enslavement of tens of thousands. And then it hits you. The Yasa was never meant to protect people. It was meant to protect Mongols. Everyone else isn't covered by the law. They're not even human in the legal sense. Their resources, assets, property. One Mongol officer, whose account was preserved by Persian historians, described it like this: "We had seen cities destroyed before. We had killed without mercy. But this was different. This was organized. It felt like we were farmers harvesting a crop, not warriors conquering an enemy. And I realized that in the Khan's vision, that's exactly what we were." Some generals embraced it enthusiastically. They became administrators of human trafficking on an industrial scale. They grew wealthy beyond imagination. But others struggled. Not because they were squeamish about violence. These were men who'd spent their lives in brutal warfare. But because the system violated something fundamental about how they understood war. In traditional steppe combat, you fought your enemy, defeated them, took their stuff, maybe took some slaves. There was a beginning and an end, a comprehensibility to it. This was different. This was turning conquest into a repeatable industrial process. It was the bureaucratization of human suffering. And the truly disturbing part, it worked. It worked incredibly well. After Bukhara came Samarkand, then Nishapur, then Baghdad. Each city that fell fed the machine. Estimates suggest that during the Mongol conquests, between 1 and 2 million people were forcibly relocated across the empire, not counting those killed or those enslaved, but kept in their home regions. Think about the logistics of moving 1 million people across Asia in the 13th century. The organization required the record-keeping, the supply chains to feed them on the march. The Mongols developed an entire administrative apparatus just for managing conquered populations. They created a registry system tracking skilled workers across the empire. A blacksmith taken from Bukhara might find himself in Karakoram, working alongside a Chinese engineer and a Russian goldsmith. It was, in a twisted way, one of the first truly global workforces. But the system was even more insidious because it created hierarchy among the enslaved themselves. At the top were skilled artisans in Mongol service. They had security. As long as they produced, they were valuable, fed, their families safe. Below them, domestic servants and concubines whose fate depended on their owner's whim, but who lived in relative comfort. Below them, agricultural laborers and general workers doing back-breaking work, but alive with minimal chance of improvement. At the very bottom, the Karash human shields whose life expectancy, once assigned, could be measured in months. This hierarchy created competition among the enslaved. The artisan didn't want to be reclassified as a laborer. The laborer didn't want to become Karash, so they worked harder. They didn't rebel, they informed on each other. The system made the enslaved population police itself. The economic impact was staggering. Mongol nobles who'd been relatively poor by steppe standards became obscenely wealthy. A single successful campaign could net an officer dozens of skilled slaves, hundreds of pounds of gold and silver, valuable trade contacts. Some generals essentially became human traffickers, selling captives to other parts of the empire or to foreign markets. Karakorum transformed from a tent city into a cosmopolitan metropolis built by enslaved artisans from a dozen different conquered peoples. The great palace had Chinese roofs, Persian gardens, European metalwork. It was a monument to organized exploitation. But perhaps most effective was how the system weaponized fear. The Mongols developed sophisticated propaganda networks. Merchants, travelers, survivors spread tales of the sorting, of entire populations being processed, of the coal deficiency. And here's the genius. These stories made cities surrender without a fight. When the Mongol army appeared, defenders knew exactly what would happen if they resisted. They'd seen what happened to Bukhara, to Samarkand. They knew about the categories, the sorting. So many cities simply opened their gates, accepted vassalage, paid tribute, provided the demanded percentage of their population for Mongol service. In this way, the system of organized slavery became a tool of bloodless conquest. The horror was so well known that the threat alone was enough. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, and every single one maintained the system. Hulagu, who conquered Baghdad in 1258, used the same sorting process. Kublai Khan in China institutionalized it into Chinese law. The Golden Horde in Russia made it part of their tribute demands from Russian princes. The system outlived its creator by centuries. Elements persisted in Central Asia until the Russian conquest in the 19th century. 600 years of continuity for a system of organized human trafficking. Here's what makes Genghis Khan so difficult for historians to assess. By the standards of his own people, he was genuinely progressive. He promoted by merit, not birth. He protected Mongol women from abuse. The boy who wore the slave's yoke became the man who built an empire on systematic enslavement. And he did it not through chaos, but through order. Not through mindless brutality, but through careful legal architecture. That should terrify us more than any tale of simple savagery. Because somewhere right now, in systems we participate in, someone is drawing a line between people who matter and people who don't. Someone is building efficiency on a foundation of organized cruelty and calling it progress. The Mongols aren't ancient history. They're a warning written in blood that we keep forgetting to read.